Hello, and welcome to Samizdat Broadcasts. Ernest Everhard, my personal meme stash on blogging page on Facebook, named for the Marxist protagonist in Jack London's dystopian classic, The Iron Heel, received the following message a while back. Also, do you think you could establish a doctrine beyond just anti-SJW? You say you are a communist, but in your policy you appear to be more of a social democrat. Are you a revolutionary socialist? Fair question and fair point, though I do think I'm more than merely anti-SJW. The deeper point is that I'm against closed and Manichaean systems of thought, of which intersectional feminism is one, and probably the most prevalent and active one in our time, which is why I tend to pay more attention to it. Revolutionary socialism, historically at least, has been another system like that. So I guess that answers that question. I think there's a great deal to be said for Marxist materialism as a means of analyzing the economic structure of any given society. But my messenger makes a good point. For someone who so often insists that part of how leftism has gone wrong so recently is its neglect of economics and class in favor of cultural and identity issues, I do tend to ignore economics and class in favor of identity and cultural issues. Physician, heal thyself. So here goes. Like I said, I like Marxist materialism in a lot of ways, and I think for its time it was a work of genius. It's a vast area of study, and I'm not going to go over all of it here. The heart of the theory, though, is the study of how relations of production, defined as, quote, the sum total of social relationships that people must enter into in order to survive, to produce, and to reproduce their means of life, were crucial, if not absolutely central, to the overall structure of any given society. Relations of production, together with productive forces, constitute the mode of production, which is a fancy way of saying economic system more generally. Productive forces refer to human labor power, which was essential in Marxist theory, and the means of production, which itself is a combination of the means of labor, the tools and techniques that the laborer uses while engaged in productive activity, and capital goods more generally, facilities, property, machinery, computers, and so forth. A lot of the stuff that would end up as assets on a balance sheet, basically. Marx's best-known theories revolve around the idea of economic class. Now, a class in the Marxist sense is defined as sharing a common relationship to the means of production. That is, quote, all people in one class make their living in a common way, in terms of ownership of the things that produce social goods. A class may own things, own land, own people, be owned, own nothing but their labor. A class may extract tax, produce agriculture, enslave and work others, be enslaved and work, or work for a wage. Most famously in Marxist theory were the capitalist bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, and the proletariat, the workers, who did not own the means of production, only their own labor power. In Marx's view, this led to an inherently exploitative relationship. The profits made by the capitalists were equal to the difference between the costs of production, ultimately attributable to the cost of labor, under the labor theory of value, of which Marx was a proponent, and the income generated by the productive activities that the capitalists controlled. Now, there's a lot more to that, and I may in the future at some point do a more in-depth video on Marxist theory. I also have a series on it that I call The Other Red Pill on my blog at Samizdat Chronicles. I'll post a link to it in the description. Go check it out sometime. Now, I think the trouble with Marxist theories is that while still useful, though not definitive, they haven't aged well. Marx wrote at a time when early industrial capitalism still had an almost feudal character to it. Some top hat and tails tycoon think any antagonist from a Charles Dickens novel or Thomas the Tanky Engine's Sir Topham Hatt. Some fellow like this owned a textile mill, sewing floor, or whatever. And whatever was left over after all of his expenses were paid from his revenue generated was his, straight out, unless he was indebted to a bank or some other patron. For reasons too numerous and complex to detail here, Marx thought that this system was ultimately doomed to fail. Capital would amass into fewer and fewer hands, and downward pressure on wages, and hence demand, would contrast with increased productivity and therefore supply, driving the whole thing to collapse like a house of cards. His famous predictions of a dictatorship of the proletariat and eventual rise of communism are, of course, well known. Whether or not what ended up happening in the USSR was an accurate reflection of what Karl Marx had hoped to see or had thought that he had foreseen due to his interpretation of the economic laws and forces of history is another matter. While I don't think he would have approved of the Soviet method, I suppose it's neither here nor there. Ultimately, in the minds of many, that constitutes evidence of the failure of Marxist theory. I think it has other problems besides that, though. To this day, the mystique of worker-controlled economies continue to enamor idealists. Perhaps had things remained the way Marx's predictions and forecasts for the development of the economies figured that they were going to go, maybe something like that, something modeled along the lines of the Paris Commune, by which Marx was inspired, would have become more general. Things would have evolved in that direction, and we would now have an almost universal system of that nature. In my experience, though, workers are not really that interested in workers' control. Workers' control actually entails more work. And the mindset that I've observed and noticed is that this is best left to professional managers. This is what they're paid the big bucks for, after all. Another thing that I think changed a fair bit was the emergence of the joint stock corporation in the mid-19th century. This changed things somewhat. Larger industrial concerns, like steel mills and the like, became too costly for all but the most obscenely wealthy of people to afford. Joint stock made it possible for somewhat less obscenely wealthy people to get in on the action as well. So now, instead of one Sir Topham Hatt type guy, many would go in together as shareholders who would elect a board of directors to run the organization. In most models of corporate governance, the board hires a CEO to manage things on a day-to-day basis. This model had the effect of separating management from ownership. Profits accrued to the shareholders, and the board and CEO were salaried employees, much like the workers themselves were, albeit much more generously compensated. Of course, the same downward pressure on wages to maximize profits remained, since profits still amounted to the difference between income and expense. But as the 19th century in Britain and this same process occurred later in other places, countervailing measures began to emerge. The rise of organized labor, government regulation of wage levels and working conditions, the gradual introduction of progressive income tax schemes used to fund social programs for the benefit of the needy, the basic planks of social democracy. This resulted in, as opposed to Marx's prediction that wages would be increasingly suppressed and you would have an immiseration of labor, the tail end of Victorian England saw wages improve for most working people vis-a-vis how they had been earlier in the century. Once these measures were in place, however, capitalism was allowed to remain. Back in the USSR, bonus points if you heard that in Paul McCartney's voice, capitalism was abolished entirely, and Lenin, no, the other Lenin, and his successors would try out actual socialism, or what they called socialism in earnest. Regrettably, history does not seem to have been kind to either the socialist or the social democratic ideals. I'll consider the reasons below. Places where capitalism was done away with entirely encountered varying degrees of bad results. The reasons included lack of competition, lack of profit incentives, stifling innovation and productivity, and the economic calculation problem. When markets are not used to allocate goods, price fluctuations are not able to signal increases or decreases in demand. I think a big part of what kills socialism, though, resides in Marx's theory of surplus value. The assumption that all profit equaled exploitation and therefore the whole value of labor should accrue to the workers or to the state results in an absence of capital markets. You see, not all of the profits went towards the top hats and tails, although of course a lot of it did, and obscene differences in wealth emerged and continue to emerge. But a lot of profit was reinvested too, and this allowed for economic growth and for jobs to increase. Where capital markets cannot exist, where stocks and bonds cannot be issued in order to raise capital, this becomes much more difficult, and this, I suspect, is a substantial factor, though by no means the only one, in why thoroughly socialized economies tend to descend into stagnation and failure. Now, what of social democracy, then? Traditionally, social democratic mixed economies tend to be the top performers in the world economy, so social democracy is the horse to bet on, is it not? Well, it is superior to either top hat and tails capitalism or communism. It's not without its limitations. Limitations that have grown harder to get around as the economy has become more globalized, though wiggle room still exists and governments, particularly neoliberal ones, are as likely to use globalization to rationalize giving away the store to corporate interests as they are to face these factors as true constraints. Nevertheless, social democracy faces main problems in the form of investment strike and capital flight. In other words, those with the capital to do so simply don't invest, and therefore there's fewer jobs, less credit, and reduced growth long term. This results in reduced taxes on high incomes, weakened unions, working-class taxpayers shelling out for bailouts, job losses due to free trade deals, taxpayers shelling out for startup costs, weakened consumer, shareholder, labor, and environmental protection legislation, and a whole host of other measures that excite Thatcherites and Reaganites. These tend to be the demands issued by capital and the investor class as a prerequisite for their investment and creation of jobs in any given jurisdiction. The competitive nature of capitalism and the drive for ever-reduced costs and increased profits drive transnational corporations to exert these pressures on governments. This is how Bill Clinton's and Tony Blair's happen. So we end up right back where we were before we considered socialism and social democracy to begin with. So what can be done? The core problem, I think, seems to be that revolutionary socialism goes too far, while social democracy maybe doesn't go far enough. I believe the answer is to go back to the basic corporate model of ownership and governance and work with rather than against market forces. If tax or wage increases really do eat into net income and therefore disincentivize further investment, then we can achieve the desired results, increased incomes for the working class and revenues for the state to then spend on social welfare through increased state and or worker ownership of shares in publicly traded corporations. To achieve this end, I believe that the following should at least be looked into and strongly considered. 1. That a public investment authority be created in order to establish one or more sovereign wealth funds. This has been done with some success in other places. The Norwegians did it with their oil industry, for example, and it has been quite successful. Doing this would require the state to begin acquiring shares in publicly traded corporations, at home, preferably, or even abroad. 2. All citizens receive a capital endowment upon reaching a certain age. This endowment would take the form of a non-transferable share in the aforementioned sovereign wealth fund. This share would naturally be equal in size only to every other share that every other citizen likewise receives. So 1 share out of millions. Plus, the state would not divest the entire value of its sovereign wealth funds in this manner. The state would retain a sizable share and reinvest the profits as well as some of the income so generated for public finance. All told, probably not enough to put anybody on easy street, but should help with those pay the rent versus feed the kids conundrums that the underclass all too often contends with. I would also suggest that the entirety of a nation's publicly traded stock would not be nationalized in this manner. A private capital market would continue to be permitted to exist. No single person or entity would be permitted a complete controlling interest in any corporation. And yet this still preserves the basic corporate model of governments and operations, except that the shareholders entitled to vote at actual shareholder meetings are now much more of the population, or at least trust companies, banks, or investment firms retained by much of the population to manage these investments should they so choose. This means partial, if not majority, votes to the board of directors, which would still be required by its fiduciary duties to maximize shareholder value, subject to any legislation or other regulation that the state should choose to impose upon them, of course, but could also be restrained by limitations imposed from within by the shareholders themselves. The obscene and ridiculous American habit of allowing the chair of the board of directors to also serve as the CEO could and should be made against the corporate charter or bylaws, for example, although this should simply be outlawed by fiat. In other words, regulation of the corporation, as previously mentioned, could thus be as much a matter of internal governance as compliance with external government legislation. Beyond these measures, social democratic measures would be vastly easier to implement, although they may be less necessary since the above measures deal with some of the structural inequalities of capitalism. This would be especially important as advances in artificial and intelligence kill ever more jobs. Fully automated luxury communism just might be possible after all. Still, I think classical social democratic or democratic socialist measures would still be desirable and should be at least strongly considered in addition to the above. For example, utilities and essential services could still best be delivered by crown corporations or universal social programs, such as single-payer health care, essential in the United States, I think, which means state-run health insurance, including, I think, prescription drug, vision, and dental plans. A negative income tax, a progressive income tax system where people earning below a certain amount receive supplemental pay from the government instead of paying taxes to the government. Beyond this, a basic income, a form of social security in which all citizens or residents of a country regularly receive an unconditional sum of money, either from a government or some other public institution, in addition to any income received from elsewhere. I would consider means testing this myself so that it's not being given to people who already make money hand over fist. And another idea is a job guarantee, where the state acts as an employer of last resort, and the public sector offers a fixed-wage job to anyone willing and able to work, thereby establishing and maintaining a buffer stock of employed workers. Organized labor, I think, should still be a big part of things, both as a means of co-determination, meaning the representation of company staff on corporate boards of directors, as is done in Germany, for example, as well as standard collective bargaining roles more generally. An ideal system of labor relations, I think, would see strict enforcement of employer neutrality in employee decisions to unionize, and would penalize senior management directly for actions that attempted to sabotage or undermine a certification campaign, or refusal to bargain in good faith with the union should such a campaign succeed, and would strongly encourage the union and management to settle their differences like reasonable people, and binding arbitration when, for whatever reason, this does not happen. Arbitrators would or should be empowered to review management's finances, business strategy, and market conditions in comparison to the union's demands, so as to make their rulings in a manner that compromises neither business viability or the rights of the employees. Strikes and lockouts, while remaining legal, should be discouraged and looked upon as a matter of last resort. Monetary policy is far from being my area of expertise, but the good folks over at Realist Left on Facebook, a good little page for left-of-center economic policy wonks, attached to the blog Social Democracy for the 21st Century, do some very good work on it. Best as I can tell, they are proponents of concepts like endogenous money and modern monetary theory. Wikipedia defines this theory as, quote, a macroeconomic theory which describes and analyzes modern economies in which the national currency is fiat money, established and created by the government. The key insight of modern monetary theory is that, quote, monetarily sovereign government is the monopoly supplier of its currency and can issue currency of any denomination in physical or non-physical forms. As such, the government has an unlimited capacity to pay for the things it wishes to purchase and to fulfill promised future payments, and has an unlimited ability to provide funds to the other sectors. Thus, insolvency and bankruptcy of this government is not possible. It can always pay. End quote. Now, I'm no macrofinance guy, and I have yet to find a highly compact guide to this idea, besides Social Democracy for the 21st Century, and there's a rather lengthy primer on the subject at neweconomicperspectives.org. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to have to research this and give my thoughts on it at some later time. I'd also suggest if economic policy wonkery of a center-left variety really interests you, go give Realist Left on Facebook. They don't have nearly enough likes. And the blog Social Democracy for the 21st Century a look. I'll post links to them in the description as well. Until then, this has been Samizdat Broadcasts. Thank you for listening. Over and out.